everybody. Jason Levine here at Prototype Con, and we're here with esteemed designer and knowledgeable gamer Lou Pulsipher. You did one of my favorite games. It was in my top 100 games of all time, Brittania. And tell me a little bit about how you came up with that game.
You know, that's a very long time ago.
Yes.
I do remember this. I remember watching a game being played called Ancient Conquest and read the rules. And Ancient Conquest was the first game that I know of, to give multiple nations to one player. But it was a war game. It had hexes, it had cardboard pieces with numbers on them, and all the nations of a player moved at the same time and could cooperate. So sometime after that, I came up with Brittania. Well, I was living in England at the time, doing my doctoral dissertation. But where the connections are, I no longer remember at all. And of course, in Brittania then, for whatever reason, I changed it quite a bit. There's an economy in Brittania, which makes it a war game rather than a battle game. Ancient Conquest was a battle game. And also, I used areas instead of hexes, which simplifies things a lot and makes it look more real to me. And then I had the nations controlled by one player moving at different times and acting separately so they can actually attack each other in certain circumstances if the player decides. And there are a lot of other changes as well. And I don't know what the road was from seeing Ancient Conquest to coming up with Brittania. I know Brittania was essentially done by 1980 because I found notes from a game that I had devised that was all of Europe that we played in 1980. It took 12 hours because it was a whole lot of nations and a whole lot of pieces. And my notes say, well, you know, if Brittania does well, maybe I can come back to this. But obviously I never did because it was just way too long and too involved.
Yeah, no, Brittania, I mean, I love it. Really, you get everything from like the Romans coming into Britain all the way up to William the Conqueror coming, and it really feels like you see that whole growth of the different tribes coming in and creating what became like England today.
Yeah, Ancient Conquest is in ancient Middle East, and that's a good situation, but a few years ago I made a list of all the possible situations I could think of for Brittania-like games, and Great Britain is the best one. I'm convinced of that now. There are invasions from all around. There are invasions more or less constantly. There's a lull. It starts with a big bang with the Roman invasion and ends with a big bang with the Norman conquest. So it was the ideal situation.
Yeah, now you also worked on one of my other favorite games of all time is Diplomacy, and you worked on a bunch of different variants and things for Diplomacy over the years.
Yes, that was my apprenticeship in game design, I would say, is making Diplomacy variants, because some of the ones I made were pretty far from the actual Diplomacy rules. I like multiplayer games. I like war games. I don't feel a need to play games that have a lot of negotiation. Obviously, Diplomacy does. Brittania does not. And it was relatively easy to do because you had the base rules, so you could write the changes to the rules rather than having to write a full set of rules, which is quite a chore and one of the more difficult parts of designing a game.
Now you do something very unique, is you like teach about board games and board game design and things like that. So tell me a little bit about, so everyone at home can hear about what you do in this regard.
Well, before I retired from college teaching, I was teaching video game design. If you want to do video game design, you start with board game design because there's a lot more immediate feedback. You don't have to have any additional skills. You don't have to have programming or artwork or anything like that. So in the end, I wrote a book entitled Game Design, which is about video game design, but I address tabletop game design a lot because of that reason. So it kind of doubles for both. And after I did that, I discovered that there are problems with writing books, and it's called pirates. And for example, when the electronic version of that book came out, I went on the torrents one day and found like 2,500 torrents which was a lot more than the number of people that bought it. So I said, I don't think I'm going to write any more books right now. I'm going to do something else. And I ran across online audiovisual classes at udemy.com. There are other places as well. And so I started making those classes. I have 9 there now. The latest one is a 6-hour class about playtesting, 6.5 hours. So there are some specialized classes and there are some broader classes. The next one I'll do will probably be strategic war game design. I'm almost done with that, and that'll be 15 hours, I think. And these are generally not free. There's one about conventions that's free, but being retired, this is my income, or a considerable part of it. And as far as I know, I'm the only person doing this kind of thing. There are lots of courses listed as game design, but what they are is learning how to write programs and do the art and so on to make a game, and there's very little game design involved.
Yeah.
But game design is a very sexy term. There are a lot of, about 500 colleges and universities just in this country who now offer video game design offer video game production classes.
Yeah.
See, even I did it. And a lot of them call it game design because it sounds cooler, but they hardly teach any game design. Because in the video game world, you almost never go to school and then immediately become a game designer because the budgets are so high, they want to go with people who are familiar with things.
Yeah. And with board games, like what kind of advice, since we're here at a ProtoCon, what kind of advice would you give to people who are starting out and wanting to design games?
Don't. Not if you want to make money, because it's very, very hard. And I'm just following Martin Wallace, who said at the UK Game Expo in 2011, he's glad he's not starting now because it's much harder. I meet so many game designers who assume that they're going to have to self-publish their own game, and they may be right. Whereas, from my point of view, you design a game to have somebody else publish it. But even then, nowadays, you have to put a lot of time into self-promotion. But decide whether you want to make money or whether you just want to enjoy designing games. My favorite game is the game of designing games. I hardly play any games, except stupid video games, because I want to spend my time designing games.
Yeah.
So I've come here, I'm not going to play a game unless I have to make up the numbers in one of my own. Because I like watching games. You know, I really like to watch games, and not everybody has that point of view. And if you're designing games to be commercial and it's not working and you don't enjoy the other parts of it, then you're not going to enjoy it, and that's probably not something you should be doing.
And like mechanisms and everything, do you usually suggest working on mechanisms first or themes first, or what do you usually suggest when you're coming up?
I don't use the word theme because it means so many different things to different people. I use the word model. I make models usually rather than abstract games. And, you know, there's a vague area in between, but war games tend to be models because they're representing something. And Euro games tend to be abstract because whether they say it represents something or not, it doesn't in the actual occurrences. See, there's 2 ways to model something. One is to have mechanisms that you can say, well, I do this in the game, and that's just like somebody does in reality, a general or whatever. This thing happens in the game, and this is just like what happens in reality. When you have an abstract game, whether it has the trappings of reality or not, a decoration or an atmosphere, you don't do things that correspond. Many of the favorite mechanisms of Euro games, like worker placement, there's nothing like that in the real world, or virtually nothing, let's say. I won't say nothing. And there are lots of mechanisms like that people like because they're easy for blocking. Euro games are about blocking and other kinds of games, and traditional old-style games like chess and so on about tackling is the way somebody put it. And I could go on about this for a long time, but I better not.
Yeah, or else we'll be here for 5 hours getting into games, which I love. I mean, it's interesting, you know, to me it's interesting that you have done something that no one else is really doing, and you're kind of you could talk about how you get into these games and how the games, you know, how you would create this or why you would do this. And
I keep learning, too. And sooner or later, if I live long enough, I'll publish a book called The Nature of Games. Because games really fall into lots of different spectra where there are extremes and things in the middle. And if a designer recognizes those, he has a better idea of what he's doing. I think most designers, when they design games, they've already made a whole lot of assumptions they don't even know they made. And it can still work just fine. But as a teacher, I want people to understand what they're doing. I don't believe in training. I believe in education, which is helping people understand so they can figure it out on their own later when I'm not around.
No, I think that's great, and obviously you've been helping people with your online programs and everything, which is a great thing.
I'm glad you think so.
I do. I mean, here, I don't know how many designers came out here. There's at least 60 or 70 designers who came out here with prototypes, and some of them, it's their first thing they've ever done. So when they get someone with a lot of experience in the industry like you to learn from or get tips from, it's always helpful.
I'll tell you, you asked about advice, and I'll give you a piece of advice that I didn't figure out until recently. And I have videos of this on my game design channel on YouTube, so you can go and see the whole bit. But I discovered that some people, when they design games, they don't really design them. They just throw things against the wall to see what sticks. They're using trial and error. Let's guess and check. Some people think trial and error is scientific. It's not. But let's guess at this and then try it out and see what happens. That can get you somewhere, but it's terribly inefficient. I want people to do things in an efficient way so they don't waste their time. That's part of the reason of being a teacher, is to help people avoid that kind of error. So to me, you should think about the game, what works, what doesn't work, what you can change, make the change, and then test it. You're more like a scientist. Not just, we could do it this way or this way. Let's try them both and see what works. Yeah, you can do that, but there are usually better ways to figure things out.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Well, thank you so much for coming out here, Lou Pulsipher.
Thank you, guys.
Designer and teacher, and this is Jason Levine with another Designer Spotlight here at Prototype Con.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at DicetowerNetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.